And joining us on the line now from London, Ontario, Carmi Levy, independent technology analyst. And Carmi, it's good to have you on the program again. How you doing?
Great, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. Let's just start, for those of our viewers who haven't followed this as carefully as you have, review some of the recent history. Why did the governments of, for example, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, why did they threaten to block BlackBerry services in their respective countries this past month?
They are all claiming that because of the way BlackBerry service is set up, the way the technology was created, that they are unable to monitor the traffic that goes across these devices and the networks that connect them. BlackBerries, unlike most other smartphones, use a process called end-to-end encryption. And so basically, it's like a secret decoder ring. As soon as you type that message on your device and you send it on its way, special encoding turns it into gibberish, so that if somebody picks it off in the middle in transit, all they see is just something that is completely not understandable. The governments want to be able to unlock that gibberish. They want to be able to decrypt that traffic, so they say they can keep track of criminals, they can keep track of terrorists, and become aware of these threats long before they actually come to fruition.
Do we take these governments at their word that that's what they're really about?
I wish we could, but truth of the matter is most of these governments, with the possible exception of India, which is the only real democracy among this group, most of them are fairly autocratic nations whose definition of democracy is very different than ours. And so on the surface they say, oh, it's anti-terrorism, it's anti-criminal activity, but truth of the matter is they have long used various means, both technological and not, to suppress their population, suppress freedom of speech, to provide a non-due diligence-based way for their law enforcement agencies to go after citizens. And so this just gives them that much more power to do exactly that.
So this was the position of those respective governments, and BlackBerry's position was what?
Well, obviously, RIM doesn't want to give away the keys to the kingdom, because if it does, it reflects badly on this, on the BlackBerry franchise. The whole brand of Research in Motion BlackBerries is that of security. It's vault-like security. It is the one device that convinced companies that for the longest time said, we will never use wireless devices to send sensitive transmissions. It convinced them that wireless, in fact, could be secure. And so, unlike any other device on the market, the BlackBerry has this rock-solid reputation. RIM doesn't just want to cave to these governments, because if it does, then that perception of the BlackBerry as rock-solid secure essentially goes away. And that's a very difficult balancing act that the company has to follow. On the one hand, you don't want to just essentially cave to these requests. On the other hand, if you don't, you run the very real risk of not being able to do business there.
So RIM and these various governments have been negotiating to try to find some kind of solution to this. Mm-hmm. How are they making out?
Well, so far, actually, things are going well. And the reason being is that nobody on either side, government or RIM, really wants these threats to be played out. Nobody wants a shutdown of BlackBerry service, because these really are the tools of the modern day economy, even in a country like Saudi Arabia. Huge amounts of business are done there. In India, 1 million people are already using BlackBerries to do business, and we know that this is RIM's most vital foreign growth market. This is where the largest number of potential future BlackBerry buyers are located. And so the government threatens to say, we will shut you down, not because they really intend to, but because they want to send a message to RIM, we're serious, we mean business, come to the negotiation table prepared to talk, and we're going to come up with a resolution that makes everybody happy. In many cases, these governments, if they didn't threaten a shutdown, perhaps RIM, because in its history, it has not always taken these requests as seriously as it could. This is just, it's a negotiation tactic more than anything.
Are these governments threatening any other companies as well? Are they picking on RIM alone?
There are other, for example, yes, in India, for example, Google, in fact, and Skype the government has threatened to go after them if they don't allow government law enforcement agencies to see traffic, to monitor, or to filter. And so there is precedent for this. There isn't similar precedent in the mobile phone market, because if you look at, for example, an iPhone, it does not have that robust end-to-end security. And so for government agencies, they're already able, in many cases, we believe, to crack those codes. And so they don't need to go to Apple and say, gee, we want to be able to see your traffic. In many cases, they already can. But the BlackBerry is so secure they can't. But there are precedents for other North American technology companies that go into foreign or emerging markets, where the governments essentially exert pressure on them to play by their rules.
Now, I know Google and China had a standoff on these kinds of issues a while ago, several months back, and I suspect many of our viewers will remember that as well. Has RIM had similar problems in China?
Yes, they have. The BlackBerry was approved for sale in China in 2007, before the Chinese government allowed RIM to start selling in market. There was about a year's worth of negotiations where, similar to what's happening now with India, with Saudi Arabia, with UAE and all these other countries, Chinese government was playing serious hardball with RIM to essentially allow the government to monitor traffic. And only when RIM allowed this to happen did the government say, okay, you can now sell the device here. The interesting thing, the difference between 2007 and today, is that today we have a very well-established social media world. And so today everybody talks about it, and it becomes a headline news-generating story simply because it gets into the grassroots. In 2007, things like Twitter was barely around. Facebook certainly wasn't developed to the degree that it is, and so there wasn't as much talk about it. So yes, there might have been a few stories on it, but ultimately when the government settled with Research in Motion, there wasn't a whole lot of coverage on it. It's very different today. Now the spotlight is shining much brighter.
So a new player in this, and that's the United Nations. And I want to read an excerpt from an Associated Press report from just earlier this month. The chief of the United Nations Telecommunications Agency urged the Canadian maker of the BlackBerry to allow law enforcement agencies access to customer data, saying that governments all over the world had legitimate security concerns which should not be ignored. The UN's entering this fracas. How has that changed the yardsticks, if at all?
It raises the stakes somewhat, because the UN doesn't want to have what's happening in India, what's happening in Saudi Arabia and UAE repeat one after the other like a domino for the next number of months or years, because that's essentially what could potentially happen here. If India gets what it wants, then a number of more countries are going to line up and ask RIM for exactly the same thing. What the UN wants to do is prevent this kind of disruptive thing from happening in all of the countries over which it has dominion. There are 175 countries now where the BlackBerry is on sale, and that number is only going to grow. They want to establish a baseline, a template, or a precedent so that, okay, let's just agree this is the way it's going to be when advanced technology goes into a country. This is the way that North American technology companies need to deal with governments. Let's do it this way so that we don't have this kind of stalemate, this kind of threat, these kinds of negotiations going forward. So what they're really trying to do is take some of the stress out of it. But of course, once it goes up to the UN, you realize this is very serious stuff.
Mm-hmm. Now, Carmi, how likely do you think it is that RIM is going to do what these governments want it to do?
Very. RIM does not have any choice at all in the matter. If RIM essentially pulls a hissy fit and says, no, we're not going to do what you want us to do, the governments will have no choice but to impose sanctions up to and including a full shutdown. And so based on what has happened in the past in China as well as in Russia, there's no reason to believe that there won't be some kind of compromise where RIM gives up something, the governments compromise as well, they give up something as well, and then everyone can essentially claim that they've quote-unquote won, and RIM can continue selling BlackBerries, and the security agencies can have their way as well. There's going to be a very tight compromise in the months to come.
But how would you suspect that the RIM customer would react to that? Because if this extra special security layer is what makes RIM and the BlackBerry so desirable, that's being compromised on. Is that a problem?
For the average consumer who just wants a really great device that makes phone calls, does texting, surfs the web, and plays music, probably not. When you walk into your retailer, you don't really care. You're just looking for a good deal on a good phone that looks good when you go to your next party. But for companies, especially in some very sensitive sectors like financial services or healthcare, companies that might be subject to regulatory requirements. In Canada, for example, privacy regulations like PIPEDA. In the US, healthcare regulations like HIPAA. They, in fact, might look at this and might question, gee, is the BlackBerry really the be-all, end-all of security anymore? Or if RIM is compromising somewhat in foreign lands, is the potential there for them to do the same thing here? So it really will give IT decision makers, technology decision makers in companies like this, a bit of a reason to pause and question whether this is the platform they want to use in future.
So they could lose some business over this?
Potentially, yes. It sort of does tend to take the shine off the rose somewhat.
All right, let me, having said that, read something that was in Maclean's magazine last month. Jason Kirby wrote this: security experts say we can expect more confrontations in the future as new devices and communication services become popular. For instance, India is now also setting its sights on Skype's internet phone service and Google's instant messaging tool. It's possible some countries will eventually object to apps designed for tablet computers like the Apple iPad. According to reports, Apple has already blocked some iPhone apps related to the Dalai Lama from appearing in its China App Store. Governments of countries such as Saudi Arabia, India, closing them off. Are they closing themselves off to potential business opportunities from foreign companies by, messing around with this area of privacy?
Potentially, yes, because anytime you reduce that flow, I mean, these technologies, iPads, Blackberries, iPhones, the software that runs on them, the networks on which they run, this really is the lubrication of the global economy. And so anytime you throw a spanner into the works, so to speak, to slow that down, you compromise a particular country's ability to participate in that global economy. So certainly it is a negative. But at the same time, this is no different than what we've seen going on for generations. This isn't new simply because we have the internet today. These governments have been using limits to technology as ways of suppressing free speech and connecting with the outside world for decades, if not longer. Tiananmen Square, Chinese government was using limitations on fax machines and phone lines to prevent the dissidents from getting their word out. So it's a new technology, but the story remains the same. And these governments, of course, the issue with the internet is it accelerates the rate of global trade. And so really what you need to do is if you are a government, you need to look at this and go, gee, am I really cutting off my nose to spite my face? Am I killing my economy for the sake of keeping tabs on my citizens? And that's going to become an even more pressing question for these governments going forward as these technologies become more sophisticated.
Okay, in which case, in our last couple of minutes, let me ask you to, if not crystal ball gaze, then at least do some informed speculation here. Developing world, developed world. Let's cut them in two here and see what the implications are for RIM's business in each. In terms of business in the developing world, how do you see this going forward?
There will be agreements in every country where there's currently an issue. A number of new countries are going to come to the fore and they're going to ask for similar treatment. There will be negotiations for those and RIM will move on and continue to sell. Absolutely critical for the company because it has pegged its future growth, most of its future growth, on these emerging nations. Right now it's growing much faster in these emerging nations than it is in North America. So it absolutely needs to make these deals and move forward, put them behind it.
And in the developed world, what do you see?
Well, in the developed world, RIM needs to continue to convince those enterprise buyers that what it's doing in the developing world isn't compromising the value of the BlackBerry that they've essentially trained us to appreciate for the better part of the last decade. So RIM does have a bit of a marketing job here to do on companies here that have settled on the BlackBerry because nothing else will do for them. RIM needs to convince them that whatever's happening outside and anywhere else in the world, that their devices will continue to be the most secure on the market and they can continue to trust them as a valued wireless partner.
And one last thing, Carmi, I guess some people have been a little sour on RIM lately, but boy, some numbers came out yesterday that maybe ought to make people think twice about that. You want to share that with us?
Yeah, RIM sold more BlackBerries in the last quarter than it ever did. It made more money in the last quarter than it ever did. It signed on more subscribers than it ever did. And it continued to rack up double-digit growth in virtually every major category. So, it's a hugely profitable, very fast-growing, incredibly successful company. On the surface, any other company would be happy to have that, and quite frankly, you do have to congratulate RIM for that kind of performance. The problem is this is happening within the broader context of a smartphone market, a global smartphone market that's growing faster than the company is. Yes, RIM is growing fast and making huge amounts of money. Apple and Google are growing even faster and making even more money. So what will happen long term is if RIM fails to change its fundamental business model, it risks falling behind these competitors and not being the global leader that it is today.
Fascinating story, and you always explain it so well. Carmi Levy, thanks so much for joining us from London tonight.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.